Every large cruise ship afloat today has a designated morgue built into its original design, hidden below deck, with enough capacity for multiple bodies, and most of the 6,000 passengers walking past that space every day have no idea it exists. That's exactly what we're breaking down today. What actually happens, step by step, when a passenger dies on a cruise ship in the middle of the ocean, sometimes days from the nearest port. And by the end of this, you'll understand why something as final as death still has to follow an incredibly precise operational protocol at sea, because nothing about it can simply wait. Here's what makes this genuinely strange to think about. A cruise ship carries thousands of people for a week or more, often skewing toward an older passenger demographic, hundreds or sometimes thousands of miles from land. Statistically, across an entire industry moving tens of millions of passengers a year, deaths on board are not rare. They're a predictable operational reality that every cruise line has to plan for in advance. And yet a ship at sea has no funeral home, no coroner's office, no local authority to simply call. So the real question isn't whether this happens. It's what specific system has to exist on board a floating vessel to handle death with the same legal, medical, and logistical seriousness it would receive on land, without a single one of those institutions physically present. Let's put the actual numbers and framework in context. Industry data suggests that on a typical large cruise ship, a death occurs roughly once every few thousand passenger days, meaning statistically, most large ships will experience at least one death within a given month of continuous sailing, particularly on longer itineraries with older passenger demographics. Every major cruise line operates under maritime law, which determines jurisdiction based on the ship's flag state, essentially which country's laws the ship legally operates under, regardless of whose waters it happens to be sailing through at the time. This matters enormously, because it determines exactly which country's authorities have to be notified, what documentation is legally required, and how the body is eventually released to the family. None of this is improvised in the moment. Every cruise line has a written, standardized death at sea protocol, and crew are trained on it well before it's ever needed. Most people assume that if someone dies on a cruise ship, the body is either kept in a passenger's cabin under strict secrecy, or the ship simply turns around and rushes to the nearest port immediately. Neither of those is generally true, and both misunderstandings come from the same wrong assumption that a death on board is treated as a crisis to be hidden or an emergency requiring an immediate diversion. In reality, it's treated as neither. It's treated as a serious procedural event with a defined sequence of steps, most of which have nothing to do with panic and everything to do with careful documentation. The first step is medical confirmation. The ship's onboard physician, the same medical team responsible for handling emergencies at sea, examines the deceased and officially confirms death, documenting the circumstances as thoroughly as possible, since this documentation will later matter to authorities on land who never witnessed the event themselves. The second step is notification. The captain is informed immediately, and depending on the ship's flag state and the nature of the death, external authorities may need to be notified in real time, sometimes including the Coast Guard or Maritime Authority of the flag state, and in certain cases, law enforcement, if the death appears to involve anything other than natural causes. The third step is the body's transfer to the ship's morgue, a small refrigerated storage space built into the ship's original design specifically for this purpose, most commonly located in a discrete area near the ship's medical center, intentionally positioned away from passenger areas and elevators to avoid any public awareness of the process. Here's the deeper engineering and legal logic connecting these steps. Cruise ship morgues are refrigerated to preserve the body properly, because unlike a hospital on land, the ship often cannot reach a port with proper mortuary facilities for several days, and the body has to remain in a stable, dignified condition until it can be legally transferred. Most large ships have morgue capacity for only a handful of bodies at once, typically somewhere between 2 and 6. A number based on actuarial data about expected death rates relative to passenger count and voyage length, not an assumption that mass casualties will ever need to be handled this way. If a death occurs and the morgue is already at capacity, which is exceptionally rare but has happened on very large ships during longer voyages, cruise lines have contingency plans, sometimes involving requesting refrigerated storage space elsewhere on board, precisely because the protocol assumes edge cases will eventually occur. In terms of what happens to the voyage itself, the ship almost never turns around immediately. Diverting an entire ship carrying thousands of other passengers is an enormous logistical and financial decision, and in the vast majority of cases, since the body can be safely preserved in the morgue, and the death doesn't represent an ongoing danger to anyone else on board, the ship continues its scheduled itinerary. The body remains in the morgue until the ship reaches its next port, or in some cases its final home port, at which point local authorities, funeral directors, and the family's chosen arrangements take over, following the flag state's legal requirements for death certification and international body repatriation if the family is in a different country than where the ship makes landfall. Now here's the specific edge case worth understanding, because it reveals where this system becomes genuinely complicated. If a death is not clearly from natural causes, if there's any indication of foul play, accident, or unclear circumstances, the case becomes both a medical and a criminal jurisdiction question simultaneously. The FBI, for example, has direct investigative jurisdiction over deaths involving U.S. citizens on ships that dock in U.S. ports or are owned by U.S.-linked companies, regardless of where in international waters the death actually occurred. In these cases, the cabin or area involved may be treated as a preserved scene. Evidence protocols kick in exactly as they would on land, and the body's handling becomes far more procedurally rigid, sometimes requiring evidence photography and specific chain of custody documentation before the body can even be moved to the morgue. This is precisely why cruise ship security staff receive training that overlaps meaningfully with law enforcement basics, because international maritime law essentially asks the ship's own crew to function as first responders and initial investigators until the vessel reaches a jurisdiction that can take over. In practice, this entire system runs almost invisibly. Passengers on a ship where a death has occurred typically have no idea anything happened at all, not because it's being covered up in some sinister sense, but because the entire protocol is deliberately designed around discretion, both for the dignity of the deceased and their family, and for the emotional experience of thousands of other paying passengers who are quite reasonably not expecting to think about death during a vacation. So death on a cruise ship isn't handled the way people imagine, either hidden in horror movie secrecy or triggering an emergency turnaround. It's handled through a quiet, precise, legally structured system: medical confirmation, flag state notification, refrigerated preservation, and a careful legal handoff at the next available port. Built specifically because a ship in international waters can't simply pause and wait for someone else to take responsibility. So the real question was never whether cruise ships are prepared for death at sea. It's how deliberately invisible that entire system is designed to be, specifically so the rest of the voyage can continue undisturbed. But death isn't the only emergency cruise ships quietly prepare for without most passengers ever noticing. What happens when the danger isn't a single passenger, but the entire ship losing all power at once in open water? I've broken that exact scenario down in another video.